Before driving away from the house, my son and daughter-in-law told me, "Dad, don't let Mom try to stand up. She can't take care of herself anymore." I nodded sadly, watching my wife sit helplessly in her wheelchair after a severe stroke. 10 minutes later, she suddenly threw off the blanket, stood up, walked toward me, and grabbed my hand tightly. "We have to leave before they come back." I was completely stunned. Only later did I discover why she had been pretending all along. "I'm so glad to have you here on Silent Sweet Revenge. Tell me your city and country in the comments below." Also note, this narrative incorporates fictional elements designed for storytelling and life lessons. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but the wisdom inside is worth keeping. Before my son Derek backed his truck out of my driveway that Monday morning, he stopped at the kitchen doorway and pointed his finger at me like I was a farmhand who needed reminding of his chores. "Dad," he said, "don't let Mom try to get up on her own. She can't manage it anymore. You know how she gets when she pushes herself." I nodded. I stood there holding my coffee mug with both hands, and I nodded like a man who had no reason in this world to question what his own son was telling him. Derek was 38 years old. He wore a clean flannel shirt, and his hair was combed back the way he always did when he wanted to look responsible. His wife, Savannah, stood behind him near the back door, already pulling on her jacket, already checking something on her phone. "We'll be back before dinner," Savannah said, without looking up. "There's soup in the refrigerator, second shelf. Don't let her eat anything cold." Then they were gone. I heard the truck engine turn over, heard the crunch of gravel under the tires, and then the sound faded down the long dirt road that cuts through the front half of my property. 80 acres of San Joaquin Valley farmland, and for 10 minutes that morning, it was just me and the quiet and the smell of coffee going cold in my hands. I walked to the window above the sink. The October sky was the kind of pale blue that comes before the heat kicks in. My old Kubota tractor sat parked beside the equipment barn, dew still on the hood. I had bought that tractor with 11 years of savings and a handshake from a man named Gerald Foss, who sold farm equipment out of Madera before his knees gave out. That was 1997. Everything I had built since then was visible from that window, and I stood there looking at it the way a man does when he doesn't know yet that something is already ending. 10 minutes. That was all it took. Behind me from the living room, I heard the soft sound of a blanket shifting. I assumed Margaret was adjusting herself in the wheelchair. 3 months since the stroke, and I had learned the sounds. She made the small efforts, the quiet frustrations of a woman who had once run the bookkeeping for my shop, and now needed help getting to the bathroom before noon. The doctors called it a mild ischemic stroke. I had never found anything mild about watching my wife of 35 years disappear inch by inch into a chair she couldn't get out of on her own. Then I heard her feet hit the floor. Not a stumble, not a fall. 2 deliberate footsteps on the hardwood, and then a third. I turned around so fast I sloshed coffee down the front of my shirt. Margaret was standing. She had both hands braced on the arms of the wheelchair, and she was upright, her chin level, her eyes clear and fixed directly on me. She was wearing the blue cardigan I had bought her for her birthday 2 years ago. Her gray hair was pinned back the way she always wore it on days when she meant business. Her right leg trembled slightly at the knee, but she did not sit back down. "Margaret." My voice came out wrong, too thin. "What are you? How are you?" She held up one hand to stop me. Then she turned slowly and carefully and reached behind the refrigerator with the confidence of someone who had done it many times before. She pulled out a folding cane, the kind with 4 rubber feet at the base, and she snapped it open in 2 practiced movements. My chest felt like someone had wrapped a fist around it and squeezed. "How long have you had that?" I asked. "Long enough," she said. Her voice was steady. Not loud, but steady in the way a fence post is steady. You don't notice how solid it is until you lean on it and find out it doesn't move. Richard, I need you to listen to me very carefully right now, and I need you to not ask too many questions until I finish. Margaret, I said listen. She took 3 steps toward me, the cane tapping against the floor, and she stopped close enough that I could see the color had come back into her face. Real color. Not the pale, exhausted gray I had been looking at for 3 months. She put her free hand on my arm, and her grip was firm. We need to leave before they come back. The coffee mug slipped in my fingers. I caught it against my palm, and the hot liquid burned my hand, and I barely felt it. And before I stopped. Started over. Derek and Savannah. Yes. Margaret, what in God's name is going on? She looked at me the way she used to look at a column of numbers that didn't add up, patient, precise, and utterly certain she was right. I've been getting better for 4 weeks, she said. My physical therapist knows. My doctor knows. I told them the truth every time they asked me. She paused. I just stopped correcting certain other people when they assumed otherwise. I stared at her. 35 years I had been married to this woman. I had sat next to her in a hospital waiting room when her mother passed. I had held her hand through 2 difficult pregnancies and one that didn't make it. I knew the sound of her breathing when she slept, and the particular way she tapped her pen against the desk when she was working through a problem. And I had not known this. You were watching them, I said. It was not a question. Her jaw tightened slightly. Get your keys, Richard, and your reading glasses. We're going to the bank first, and then we're going to Tom Greer's office, and I am going to tell you everything on the way. My keys were on the hook by the back door. I had hung that hook myself in 1991 using a drill bit I still had in the shop. My hand was shaking when I reached for them. Margaret. My throat tightened around her name. How much do you know? She was already moving toward the back door, cane steady steps, careful but sure. Enough, she said. I know enough. Now let's go before they get back and I have to be helpless again. I had not driven that old Ford pickup with Margaret in the passenger seat for 3 months. The last time was the morning of her stroke when I drove her to the emergency room at Valley Medical with her right hand pressed flat against the dashboard and her words coming out sideways, half-formed like she was trying to speak through water. I had run 2 red lights. I had not thought about that drive since. Now here we were again on the same road heading toward town, and she was sitting straight up with the cane across her knees, and her hands folded on top of it like she was about to chair a board meeting. Start talking, I said. I am gathering my thoughts. Margaret, you just walked across our kitchen floor after 3 months in a wheelchair. My thoughts are already gathered. You can start any time. She turned to look at me and the corner of her mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. Almost. Linda Foss told me 6 weeks ago that I was ready to try the cane, she said. She said I had progressed faster than she expected. Strong left side improving right. Balance still needs work, but functional. Her words. Linda Foss was the physical therapist the hospital had arranged to come to the house 3 times a week. I had met her maybe 4 times total. She was a quiet woman in her 40s who carried a canvas bag full of resistance bands and always left her shoes at the back door. I had assumed she was giving me accurate reports through Savannah, who had taken over scheduling the sessions and relaying updates when I was at the shop. I kept my eyes on the road. Savannah told me you were still struggling to stand without the walker. I know what Savannah told you. The way she said it sat in the cab of that truck like something with weight. I cracked the window and let the October air come in and tried to think straight. Linda tried to reach you directly, Margaret continued. She called the house twice. Savannah answered both times and told her you were unavailable and that all communication about my care should go through her. Linda told me this herself during a session when Savannah had stepped outside to take a phone call. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The leather was cracked in 2 places near the top, worn smooth from years of the same grip. I had never noticed how much of my life I had spent holding on to things that were slowly falling apart. Why didn't Linda push back? I asked. She's a medical professional. She has obligations. Savannah was very careful, Margaret said. She never threatened her directly. She simply made it clear that if Linda went around her, it could create complications with the family relationship that might affect future referrals. Small threat. Quiet threat. The kind that doesn't leave marks. Margaret's voice stayed even, but her hands pressed down harder on the cane. And then there were the pills. I glanced at her. What pills? So every evening after dinner, Savannah would bring me what she called my nighttime supplement. Melatonin, she said. To help me sleep. She paused. The first few nights I took them. I slept heavily and woke up with my legs feeling like they were wrapped in wet concrete. I assumed it was the stroke, the medication, the recovery. I did not question it. And then one evening, Savannah brought the pills and got a phone call at the same moment and set the little cup on my nightstand and went out to the hallway to talk. I picked up one of the pills and looked at it. She held up 2 fingers, the space between them about the width of a thin tablet. It was not melatonin. It was a Benadryl. Diphenhydramine, an antihistamine that causes heavy sedation, particularly in people over 60, available at any drugstore. Legal, common, and in the right dose for someone my age, absolutely sufficient to make a recovering stroke patient feel 20% worse every single morning. The truck drifted slightly to the right, and I corrected it without thinking. Diphenhydramine. I knew that word. I had taken it myself years ago during allergy season, knocked myself sideways by 2 in the afternoon, and sworn off it permanently. For a woman in stroke recovery, for Margaret, every morning she woke up from that drugged sleep, she would have been fighting her own body just to sit upright. How many nights? My voice came out scraped thin. 11, she said. Then I started dropping them into the planter by the window instead. Within 10 days, I could feel the difference. She turned to look out the passenger window at the flat brown fields going by the irrigation channels, catching the morning light. That was when I understood that their being here had nothing to do with taking care of me. I did not say anything for a long moment. There was nothing to say that would have fit inside the cab of that truck without breaking something. You should have told me, I finally said. She looked back at me, and her expression was not angry. It was something harder than angry. It was the face of a woman who had already thought through every version of this conversation and had arrived at the only honest answer. If I had told you 5 weeks ago, what would you have done? I opened my mouth. She waited. I would have asked Derek, I said. Yes, she said simply. You would have. The grain elevator that marks the edge of town came into view on the horizon, tall and gray against the pale sky. 40 years I had driven past that elevator. It had always meant I was almost home, or almost somewhere I needed to be. That morning, it meant we were almost at the bank, and whatever I was going to find inside those printed pages was going to be the kind of thing a man does not get to unknow. Is there more? I asked. Margaret reached into the canvas bag at her feet and pulled out a folded envelope. She held it in her lap without opening it. "There is considerably more," she said. "But let's start with the account statements. One thing at a time, Richard. One thing at a time." The Central Valley Community Bank sat on the corner of Ashland and Fifth, a single-story building with a flat roof and a parking lot that needed resurfacing about 5 years ago, and still did. I had banked there since 1988. I knew the layout the way I knew my own equipment barn, where everything was which drawer stuck in summer, which fluorescent light above the teller windows had been flickering since the Clinton administration. Patty Morrow had worked the customer accounts desk for going on 22 years. She was a heavy-set woman in her late 50s with silver-streaked hair she kept pinned back and a way of looking at you over the top of her reading glasses that made you feel like she already knew what you were going to ask before you finished asking it. When Margaret and I walked through the front door that morning, Patty looked up from her desk, and her expression went through 3 separate things in about 2 seconds. Recognition, surprise, then something more careful that I did not have a name for yet. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, and she was already standing. "Hello, Patty." Margaret moved the cane forward and took another step. "I was hoping you had a few minutes." Patty came around the desk without being asked. She glanced at me briefly, the kind of glance that was really a question, and I gave her nothing back because I did not have anything to give yet. She led us to the small office at the back, the one with the frosted glass door and the dying plant on the windowsill that had been dying for at least 4 years. She closed the door behind us. "What can I do for you both?" she asked. Margaret set her canvas bag on the desk. "I need complete transaction records for our joint checking and the farm operating account. Everything from July 1st through today." Patty's expression shifted into the careful, professional neutral that bank employees use when they sense something has gone wrong in a family. "Of course," she said. "Give me a few minutes." While Patty pulled the records, I sat in the chair beside Margaret and looked at the dying plant and thought about nothing in particular, because thinking about particular things was going to require me to be a different kind of man than I had been for the last 3 months. Margaret sat with her hands on her cane and her eyes on the closed door and said nothing. Her jaw was set. I had seen that jaw my entire adult life, and I knew better than to interrupt it. Patty came back with 2 sets of printed pages stapled at the corner and laid them on the desk between us. She sat down across and folded her hands. "The joint checking is on top," she said. "Farm operating account is underneath." I picked up the joint checking first. The early pages were familiar utility bills, the pharmacy charges that had tripled since Margaret's stroke, the physical therapy invoices, a payment to the medical supply company for the wheelchair. Normal. Painful, but normal. Then the pattern changed. "What is this one?" Margaret asked. She pressed her finger against a line about halfway down the 3rd page. Patty leaned forward. "Farm equipment maintenance. August 9th, $8,500. "We didn't have any equipment maintenance in August," I said. "My Kubota had been serviced in May. My secondary tiller hadn't needed work since spring." "Who authorized that transfer?" Patty looked at me steadily. "The account shows it was initiated by an authorized secondary account holder." She paused carefully. "Derek Calloway." Margaret turned the page without reacting. I watched her do it and felt something cold move through my chest. She had already known. She had been sitting beside me, watching me discover it in real time, and she had already known every line on every page. We went through it together. 8,500 here, 9,200 there. Property repair, 7,800. Equipment parts, 8,900. Irrigation assessment, 9,400. Each transaction just under $10,000. I noticed that immediately a man who has run a business for 35 years learns to notice round numbers and the spaces just below them. He kept them under 10,000 on purpose, I said. Patty pressed her lips together in a way that confirmed it without saying it. Under federal banking regulations, financial institutions are required to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. Keeping individual withdrawals below that threshold, a practice called structuring, is a method used to avoid triggering that automatic reporting requirement. Derek had not done this by accident. He had done it 9 separate times over 6 weeks. By the time we reached the last page, the total was $78,000. Transferred in pieces labeled with legitimate-sounding purposes, moved into an account registered to Derek Callaway Construction, LLC. I set the papers down on the desk. My hands were not shaking anymore. They had passed through shaking and come out the other side into something steadier and colder that I did not entirely recognize. "Patty," I said, "that account he transferred into, is it held at this bank?" "I can confirm it was opened here approximately 4 months ago," she said carefully. "I'm not able to share details about a separate account holder without authorization. But Mr. Callaway—" She paused, and for just a moment, the professional neutral slipped, and something genuinely concerned came through underneath it. "If transactions were made from your account without your direct authorization, you should speak with an attorney today. Not tomorrow. Today." Margaret picked up the stapled pages and folded them into her canvas bag with the same deliberate steadiness she used for everything that morning. Then she looked at Patty. "Thank you," she said. "You've always been good to this family." Patty walked us back to the front door. At the threshold, she touched my arm once lightly and did not say anything else. She did not need to. 22 years of watching families walk in and out of that office had given her a vocabulary that did not require words. Outside, the October sun had burned off the morning haze. I helped Margaret to the passenger side and stood for a moment with my hand on the doorframe. $78,000, 9 transactions, 6 weeks. I got behind the wheel and started the engine. "Tom Greer's office," Margaret said. "I know," I said. I pulled out of the parking lot and did not look back. Tom Greer had been practicing real estate and agricultural law in Fresno County for 31 years. His office was on the 2nd floor of a building on Fulton Street, above an insurance agency that had been there even longer. The waiting area smelled like old carpet and printer toner, and the particular kind of quiet that collects in places where people come to solve problems they cannot solve themselves. His assistant, a young woman named Brianna, showed us in without making us wait. Tom was already standing when we came through the door. He was a lean man in his early 60s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and the kind of permanent squint you get from spending too many years reading small print under bad lighting. He had helped me with the deed transfer on the East Parcel back in 2019, and before that with a boundary dispute involving my neighbor Gerald Foss that had nearly ended a 40-year friendship. He shook my hand and then turned to Margaret, and something shifted in his expression when he saw her standing with the cane. "Margaret," he said quietly. "Tom." She settled into the chair across from his desk. "Thank you for seeing us without an appointment." "Never need one." He sat down and looked at me. "Tell me why you're here." I set the bank statements on his desk. He read through them without interrupting, turning pages slowly, and I watched his jaw tighten on the 3rd page and stay tight through the rest. When he finished, he set them down and folded his hands on top of them and looked at me the way a doctor looks at you when the test results are what he suspected but hoped they wouldn't be. "The structuring is deliberate," he said. 9 transactions, all between $7,000 and $9,000. He knew exactly what he was doing. He tapped the top page. This alone gives you grounds for a civil claim under California's Elder Financial Abuse Statute. Welfare and Institutions Code, Section 15.6.10.30. It covers financial abuse of adults over 65. If we can prove the transfers were unauthorized or misrepresented, you can recover the full amount plus attorney's fees and potentially additional damages if the court finds the conduct was willful. Can it be proven? I asked. That depends on what he told you the money was for and whether you have any documentation showing what it was actually used for. Tom picked up a pen. What did he say when he transferred the first amount? He said the north irrigation line needed relining. 2,200 feet of PVC. He showed me an estimate. Do you have the estimate? He handled it. Said he'd keep the paperwork. Tom wrote something down. Of course he did. He set the pen down. There's something else I need to show you. Margaret called me 3 days ago and asked me to pull something together. He opened the manila folder on the left side of his desk and removed 2 sets of documents, each about 4 pages thick, and laid them side by side facing me. I leaned forward. The left set was printed on plain white paper with a physical therapy letterhead at the top. Linda Foss, licensed physical therapist, Valley Rehabilitation Services. The right set was a photocopy slightly darker with a court filing stamp in the upper right corner. Fresno County Superior Court. The name on the filing was Savannah Calloway, petitioner. Read the left one first, Tom said. Top paragraph, 3rd line. I found it. Linda Foss's handwriting in the notes section, transcribed to typed text below patient, demonstrating significant functional improvement beyond initial prognosis. Independent ambulation with quad cane achieved at week 6. Balance deficits remain but are not limiting for basic daily activities. Patient is cognitively intact, oriented to person, place, and time. Recommend continuation of outpatient therapy. Full independent living capacity likely within 8 to 12 weeks. I read it twice. Then I looked at the right set. The court filing. The same header, the same therapist name, but only the first page reproduced. The first page from week 2 of therapy, when Margaret could not stand without 2 people supporting her, and her words still came out tangled. The rest had been removed. Tom placed his finger on the filing stamp. Savannah submitted this to the court as supporting documentation for a conservatorship petition. Under California Probate Code, a petitioner requesting conservatorship must provide current medical documentation of the proposed conservatee's condition. What she submitted is not current. It is 6 weeks out of date and represents the worst point of Margaret's recovery. The sections showing improvement were not included. He paused. That is not an oversight. Pages do not fall out of medical records by accident. My throat had closed down to about the diameter of a drinking straw. I looked at the 2 documents side by side on Tom's desk and felt something move through me that was not anger, not yet, because anger requires energy, and what I felt right then was closer to the bottom, dropping out of a container I had not known I was carrying. She filed this with a court, I said. She filed a petition, yes. It hasn't been heard yet. The court has set a preliminary date for late November. But Tom leaned forward, both forearms on the desk. If this petition had proceeded without challenge and if you had not appeared to contest it, a judge could have appointed a conservator with legal authority over Margaret's finances and personal decisions. Potentially over yours as well, given that the petition references your age and the complexity of your assets. Margaret had not said a word since we sat down. I turned to look at her. Her face was composed in the way a landscape is composed after a storm has already passed through it. Everything still, everything rearranged, nothing the way it was before. "Can we stop it?" I asked Tom. "Already started," he said. "Margaret authorized me 3 days ago to prepare a revocation of the power of attorney Derek holds over the shop. I have it ready for your signature, and I've drafted a formal response to the conservatorship petition with Linda Foss's complete records attached." He slid a single page across the desk toward me. "Sign the revocation first. Then we'll talk about what comes next." I picked up the pen. My hand was steady. I did not know when that had happened, but somewhere between the bank and this office the shaking had stopped, and something else had taken its place. I read every line of the revocation before I signed it. Every single line. The drive home took 23 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way. Not because I was in a hurry, but because I needed something to look at that was not the road, or my hands or my wife sitting beside me with a canvas bag full of documents that had just rearranged everything I thought I understood about the last 3 months of my life. Margaret did not speak first. She never did when she was letting me catch up. I turned onto the county road that runs along the western edge of my property. The one with the oleander hedge on the left that I have been meaning to trim back for 2 years. The afternoon light was coming in low and gold across the fields, the kind of light that makes the San Joaquin Valley look like something painted rather than something real. I had always loved that light. That afternoon, it felt like it belonged to a different version of the day than the one I was living in. "Aunt, did you know?" I said, "before the stroke, did you have any idea what they were planning?" Margaret turned her head toward the window. "No," she said. "When they first arrived, I was genuinely grateful. Derek was attentive. Savannah cooked. They took the night medications to the pharmacy so I wouldn't have to ask you to leave the shop." She paused. "It was only after I started feeling stronger and nobody seemed to notice or care that I began paying attention differently." "What does that mean, paying attention differently?" "It means I started listening to the conversations they had when they thought I was asleep." She turned back to face forward. Savannah on the phone with someone describing the farm, the acreage, the road access. She used words like developable and frontage and projected return. "I am 66 years old, and I ran the books for your business for 20 years. I know what those words mean when someone uses them about land they do not own." I pulled into the long gravel drive and stopped the truck in front of the house. Neither of us moved to get out. The engine ticked as it cooled, and somewhere out behind the equipment barn, one of the barn cats was making the particular sound they make when they have found something they intend to kill. "I owe you an apology," I said. "Richard, no." I turned in the seat to face her. My chest felt like something large and heavy had been sitting on it for 3 months and had only just now shifted. "I owe you an apology. You were sitting 10 feet away from me every single day, and I was getting my information about your condition from our son and his wife. I never once sat down next to you and asked you myself how you were actually doing, not once." Margaret looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were dry. Mine were not. I felt the heat move up behind them and pressed my jaw together hard and breathed through it. "You trusted your son," she said. "That is not a character flaw, Richard. That is what fathers do. It's what they counted on." "Yes," she said quietly. "It is." I wiped the back of my hand across my eyes once and left it at that. There was too much still to do for anything more than once. I reached over and put my hand on hers where it rested on the cane, and she turned her hand over and held mine the way she had held it in hospital waiting rooms and through harvests that failed. And through the year we lost the North Well and thought we might lose the farm entirely. 35 years of a grip that knew what it meant to hold on. How much do they know, I asked, about what we've done today? Nothing yet. They left this morning thinking I could barely get myself to the bathroom. The corner of her mouth moved. As far as Derek and Savannah are concerned, I have spent the day in my wheelchair watching television and eating the soup Savannah left in the second shelf of the refrigerator. Which you did not eat. Which I did not eat. It had too much salt. She has never learned to season properly. I laughed. It came out unexpected and rough, scraped up from somewhere I hadn't expected to find anything worth laughing at, and it lasted about 4 seconds before it turned into something else that I swallowed back down. Margaret squeezed my hand once firmly and then released it. "We need to go inside," she said. "They'll be back before 6. I need to be in the chair before that truck comes through the gate." I got out and came around to her side and helped her down from the cab. She was steadier than I expected, steadier than I had seen her in months, which I now understood was because I had been watching a medicated version of my wife drag herself through mornings that should have been getting easier, and were instead being held in place by a small white pill in a paper cup delivered every evening with a smile. At the back door, I stopped with my hand on the screen. "Tonight," I said, "when they come home, I need to behave normally." "Yes. I am not certain I can look at my son across the dinner table and behave normally." Margaret stepped past me through the door. "You have been doing it for 3 months without knowing there was anything wrong," she said. "Tonight you will do it knowing exactly what you know. That should make it considerably easier." She moved through the kitchen toward the living room. "Get the wheelchair from the hall closet. And Richard." She stopped at the doorway and looked back at me over her shoulder. "Whatever you feel tonight, keep it in your chest. We are not finished yet." I stood in my own kitchen holding the screen door open, the afternoon air warm on my back, and understood that my wife had been the most capable person in this house for considerably longer than 3 months. Derek's truck came through the gate at 5:47. I know the exact time because I was sitting in the armchair by the front window with a book I had not read a single word of, watching the driveway the way a man watches a weather system moving in from the west when he knows the forecast and cannot do anything about it except make sure everything valuable is secured before it hits. Margaret was in the wheelchair, blanket across her knees, hands folded in her lap, the television on low. She had arranged herself with the particular precision of someone who has thought carefully about exactly how helpless they need to appear. When I had brought the wheelchair out from the hall closet 30 minutes earlier, she had lowered herself into it without a word and tucked the cane behind the side table where it had always been, and the transformation had been so complete and so immediate that it made my stomach turn in a way I had not expected. I heard Derek's boots on the back steps, then the screen door, then the inner door, and then my son was standing in the kitchen doorway, holding 2 brown paper bags from the Habit Burger on Shaw Avenue, and wearing the expression of a man who has decided in advance that tonight is going to go a particular way. "Thought you two might be tired of soup," he said. He held up the bags. "Got the usual. Charburger for you, Dad. Grilled chicken for Mom. Extra pickles on both." He remembered our orders. He had always remembered our orders. That was the thing about Derek that made everything harder than it should have been. He was not wrong about everything. He was not a stranger wearing my son's face. He was my son who remembered that I liked extra pickles and that his mother did not take onions, and who was also the same man whose name appeared 9 times on a bank statement I had folded into my shirt pocket that morning. "That was thoughtful," I said. My voice came out even. I was surprised. Savannah came in behind him, carrying her work bag and a bottle of Kendall Jackson Chardonnay, the kind she bought when she wanted to signal that the evening was going to be relaxed and pleasant, whether anyone else agreed or not. She set the wine on the counter and bent to look at Margaret with the careful attentiveness of a woman performing attentiveness rather than feeling it. "And how are you feeling, Margaret? Did you rest today?" "I watched my programs," Margaret said. Her voice had gone softer, slower. The voice I had been hearing for 3 months and had accepted without question. "The Price is Right had a good episode." "That's wonderful." Savannah straightened and began opening the wine. "You need the rest. The therapist is coming Thursday. We want you strong for that." She said it like a gift. Like she was giving Margaret something by scheduling a therapy session that she had already been canceling at will for 6 weeks. I looked at the bottle of wine in Savannah's hand and thought about small paper cups and Benadryl and 11 nights of my wife waking up with concrete in her legs, and I kept my face exactly where it needed to be. We ate at the kitchen table. Derek talked about a job site near Clovis where the concrete pour had gone wrong and cost him 2 days of rework. He talked about traffic on the 99. He cut his burger in half the way he had done since he was 11 years old, and ate the left half first, always the left half, and I sat across from him and watched him do it, and felt the strange, doubled vision of knowing someone completely and not knowing them at all. After dinner, Derek poured coffee without being asked, which was what he did when he wanted something. I had learned that about him sometime around his 30th birthday. The coffee was the overture. Whatever came after the coffee was the actual point. He set my mug in front of me and sat back down and wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at the table for a moment, the way a man does when he is arranging his face before he lifts it. "Dad," he said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. The business is in trouble." He said it like it cost him something. His voice had gone rough at these edges, and his jaw was working in a way that I recognized from when he was a teenager and had broken something and was deciding whether to tell me. "I have been managing it, but the Clovis project went significantly over budget, and I am carrying more debt than I should be, and I—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I lost about $30,000 on a subcontracting deal that went bad. I should have told you sooner. I am telling you now because I think you deserve to know. 30,000. Not 78. 30. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug and felt the heat come through the ceramic and held myself very still, the way I held myself still during calving season when something was going wrong and panicking would only make it worse. Margaret was visible over Derek's left shoulder, sitting in her wheelchair with her eyes on the television, and I saw her right hand tighten once around the armrest and release. "That's a significant loss, son," I said. "I know." His eyes were wet. The moisture was real. I could see it catch the kitchen light. "I am not asking you to bail me out. I just wanted you to know. I wanted to be honest with you." Honest. He used that word, and I sat with it and nodded slowly and said, "I appreciate you telling me and meant none of it and every part of it simultaneously, which is the particular misery of loving someone you can no longer trust." Savannah reached across and put her hand over Derek's on the table. A gesture of wifely support so well-timed it had clearly been rehearsed. Derek turned his hand over and held hers and looked at me with wet eyes and $30,000 of confession sitting between us like a magician's handkerchief, big enough to see, small enough to hide everything underneath it. I drank my coffee. I said the right things. And across the room, Margaret watched her television program and did not look at me once. I have always been the one who gets the mail. 35 years on this property, and it has always been me out the back door before 7 down the gravel drive, in whatever boots I pulled on back inside before the coffee finished brewing. Margaret used to say, I checked the mail the way other men checked the stock market, like something in that metal box at the end of the driveway was going to change the shape of the day. She was not wrong. I just never expected her to be right in the way she turned out to be right on the morning of October 8th. Derek and Savannah's truck was still in the yard when I went out. They had been sleeping later than usual, which I had noticed and filed away without comment. The October air was sharp and clean the way it gets in the valley after the overnight temperature drops below 50, and my breath came out in a small cloud in front of me as I walked the length of the drive. The oleander hedge needed trimming. The gravel had washed thin in 2 spots near the gate where the runoff from the north field crossed the drive every time it rained. I noted these things the way I always noted them automatically, the ongoing inventory of a man responsible for a piece of land. The mailbox held 4 envelopes. 3 were immediately recognizable, the Edison bill in its standard white envelope, a seed catalog from Territorial that Margaret had been ordering from since 1994, and a notice from the Farm Equipment Association about their fall meeting in Tulare. The 4th was different. It was a heavier stock envelope, cream colored, with a printed return address in the upper left corner, Fresno County Superior Court, B.F. Sisk Federal Building, Fresno, California. I stood at the end of my driveway and looked at that envelope for a long moment before I opened it. The morning was quiet around me. A red-tailed hawk was working a thermal over the alfalfa field to the east, circling without effort, and somewhere behind me one of the barn cats knocked something over in the equipment shed, and then was quiet again. Normal sounds. Normal morning. The envelope in my hand was neither of those things. I opened it. The document inside was 7 pages printed on legal weight paper, the heading centered at the top of the first page in a font designed to make clear that whatever followed carried the weight of an institution behind it. Petition for appointment of conservator of the person and estate. In the matter of Richard James Callaway and Margaret Ellen Callaway, proposed conservatees. Petitioner Savannah Marie Callaway. I read the first page standing at the end of my driveway in the cold morning air, with my breath coming out in small clouds and my hands holding the paper steady through what felt like considerable effort. The petition alleged that Margaret suffered from significant cognitive and physical impairment as a result of her stroke, rendering her unable to manage her own financial affairs or make appropriate decisions regarding her personal care. It further alleged that Richard, due to his age of 68 and the complexity of the farm's financial obligations, was at risk of being unable to adequately manage the couple's combined assets without professional oversight. It requested that the court appoint a conservator. The petition suggested a professional fiduciary rather than a family member, though it noted that Savannah Callaway was willing to serve in that capacity if the court deemed it appropriate, with full authority over the Callaway estate, including the farm, the equipment shop, associated real property, and all financial accounts. Full authority over everything I had spent 35 years building. Under California Probate Code, a conservatorship grants the appointed conservator legal control over a person's finances and, in some cases, their living arrangements and medical decisions. The proposed conservatee has the right to contest the petition, but the burden shifts. The court must be convinced that the person is capable, not merely that the petitioner is wrong. Without Linda Foss's complete records and Tom Greer's formal response, a judge looking only at the documents Savannah had submitted would have seen a 66-year-old stroke patient who had not shown meaningful improvement and a 68-year-old farmer managing an increasingly complex estate. He would have seen exactly what Savannah had designed him to see. I folded the petition back into its envelope. My jaw was tight enough that I could feel it in my back teeth. I breathed in through my nose and out through my mouth twice deliberately, the way I had taught myself to breathe during difficult calvings when everything was going wrong and the animal needed me calm, even when I was not. Then I looked up at the house. The kitchen light was on. Through the window, I could see the shape of Savannah moving near the coffee maker. Her back to me, her hair down, wearing the oversized sweatshirt she wore every morning. She looked completely ordinary. She looked like a daughter-in-law making coffee in her in-law's kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October. She looked like nothing at all. I put the Edison bill and the seed catalog and the Farm Association notice under my arm. I put the cord envelope in the inside pocket of my barn jacket against my chest, where I could feel it with every breath. Then I walked back up the driveway toward the house, my boots crunching on the thin gravel, and I pushed open the back door and stepped into the warmth of my own kitchen. "Morning, Dad," Savannah said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." "Thank you," I said. I hung my jacket on the hook by the door. I set the mail on the counter. I pulled out my chair at the kitchen table, the one to the left of the head. The second chair, because the head of the table had not been mine for some time now. And I sat down and folded my hands and waited for the coffee, and did not say one single word about what was pressing against my ribs from inside my jacket pocket. Margaret appeared in the doorway from the hall in the wheelchair blanket, arranged, hands folded. She looked at me. I looked at her. Her eyes dropped to the jacket on the hook, then came back to my face, and something passed between us that had no name and needed none. "Good morning, Richard," she said. "Good morning," I said. "Sleep well." "Well enough," she said. "Well enough. There is a particular kind of loss that does not announce itself. It does not come through the door with a bill of sale or a legal notice or a moving truck. It comes quietly, one small thing at a time, and by the time you notice the shape of what is missing, you are already standing in the middle of it. I had been standing in the middle of it for weeks before I understood what I was standing in. It started with the bedroom. I did not notice it happening because it happened gradually, the way water finds its way under a door, not all at once, but persistently, until one morning you realize the floor is wet and has been wet for some time. Derek and Savannah had taken the master bedroom within the first 2 weeks of their arrival. The stated reason was that Margaret needed to be closer to the hall bathroom for nighttime trips, and the small bedroom at the end of the hall was more convenient for that purpose. I had agreed, because it was presented as practical, and because I was thinking about Margaret's comfort, and not about the fact that I was being moved out of the room I had shared with my wife for 31 years. My clothes went into the closet at the end of the hall. My reading lamp went with them. The nightstand that had been mine, the one with the broken drawer pull that I had been meaning to fix since 2019, disappeared from the master and reappeared in the small room. And for some reason, that broken drawer pull was the detail that stayed with me, the fact that they had moved it without fixing it, as though the brokenness of it was simply part of the inventory they were managing. The master bedroom, when I passed the open door in those first weeks, looked different. Savannah had moved things. Small things at first, a different throw blanket across the foot of the bed, a different arrangement of the items on the dresser. Then larger things. A print she had brought from their house in Clovis appeared on the wall above the headboard, a watercolor of the California coast that had nothing to do with anything in our lives. The wedding photograph that had hung on that wall since the week we moved in, Margaret and me in front of the Fresno County Courthouse in June of 1990, Margaret in her grandmother's dress, me in the suit I had borrowed from my uncle and never quite filled out properly, was gone. I looked for it for 3 days before I found it. It was in the equipment barn, standing upright behind the old chest freezer we use for storing vaccine supplies during calving season, leaning against the wall in a space that collected dust and spiderwebs and things that were on their way to being forgotten. The frame was undamaged. The photograph itself was fine. Someone had simply decided it did not belong on the wall anymore, and had moved it to a place where things go when nobody wants to look at them. I carried it back into the house and hung it in the kitchen on the wall beside the back door, where I could see it from the table. I did not say anything about it to Derek or Savannah. Savannah noticed it that evening and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at me and smiled in a way that did not reach any part of her face above her mouth. I smiled back with the same amount of warmth, which was none, and we left it at that. Then there was the table. I have sat at the head of my kitchen table since the year we moved into this house. It was not a rule that anyone stated. It was simply the way things were, the way certain arrangements settle into place in a household over decades and become part of the structure of the place, without anyone choosing them deliberately. I sat at the head. Margaret sat to my left. Guests and family sat in the remaining chairs. This had been true for 31 years. Sometime during the third week of their stay, I came in from the shop at dinner time and found Savannah already seated at the head of the table. Not in a guest chair. Not in the chair to the right or the left. At the head. Derek was beside her. The other chairs were arranged as though the seating had always been this way. There was a pot of something on the stove, and the table was set, and there was simply no longer a chair for me at the position I had occupied for 31 years. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding my hat and looked at the table. Savannah looked up at me and said pleasantly, "Oh, sit anywhere, Richard. It doesn't really matter, does it?" It was not a question. The way she said it made clear that she had already decided the answer, and the answer was no. It did not matter, because the person who used to determine where things mattered had been quietly reclassified into someone who sat wherever there was space. I pulled out the chair to the right of where I had always sat, and I sat in it, and I put my hat on the corner of the counter, and I served myself from the pot on the stove, and I ate my dinner. Margaret caught my eye once across the table, and then looked back at her plate. Her jaw was tight. Her right hand, the one that still shook sometimes in the mornings, was pressed flat against the table beside her bowl, and I could see the effort it took her to keep it there. That evening, I sat on the back porch after dark and looked out at the fields and thought about 31 years of a kitchen table and a wedding photograph and a room that had been mine, and I understood something that I should have understood sooner. They were not just after the farm and the money. They were practicing. Every small displacement, every rearranged object, every chair that was no longer mine, was a rehearsal for the larger erasure that the petition in my jacket pockets was designed to make permanent. They were replacing us before they had finished removing us. And I had sat at the wrong chair and smiled and said nothing, and the meal had tasted like nothing at all. The kitchen window above the sink faces the side yard, the narrow strip of ground between the house and the equipment barn where I park the ATV and keep the garden hoses coiled on their bracket, and where Margaret used to grow tomatoes in 3 large ceramic pots before her knees made bending difficult. On a still morning, you can hear everything that happens in that side yard from inside the house. And on a still morning in late September, sound travels the other way just as clearly. I had gone out early to check the irrigation timer on the north field. The timer had been giving me trouble since August, sticking on the second cycle, and I had been meaning to replace the solenoid valve for 3 weeks. I came back around the side of the house rather than the front, because the gate latch on the front fence had been stiff, and I did not feel like wrestling with it before I had finished my coffee. I came around the corner of the equipment barn and stopped. Savannah was standing in the side yard with her back to me, phone to her ear, speaking in the focused and particular voice she used when she was working. Not the pleasant daughter-in-law voice. The other one? The one that had numbers in it. I stood at the corner of the barn, and I did not move, and I listened. Stigu. "The road access is excellent," she was saying. "2 county road frontages, which is unusual for a parcel this size. The soil quality is secondary to the location given the proposed development corridor, but it photographs well, and that matters for initial interest." A pause. 80 acres at current assessed value is one thing, but once the zone change goes through, it reprices completely. I would expect offers in the 1.8 to 2.2 range within 60 days of listing. Another pause shorter. No, the current owners are not an obstacle. The father is 68, the mother had a stroke 3 months ago. I have that in hand. She laughed. It was a small professional laugh, the kind that belongs in an office rather than a side yard, the kind that has nothing warm in it. 60 days after we list, maybe 90. It moves fast once it's properly positioned. She ended the call and stood for a moment, looking at her phone, scrolling something, and then walked back toward the house without turning around. She did not see me. I was still standing at the corner of the barn with one hand flat against the wood siding and the morning air cold in my lungs and the solenoid valve for the irrigation timer in my other hand, which I had completely forgotten I was carrying. I have owned this land for 35 years. I know every acre of it, where the clay soil runs heavy in the northwest corner, where the groundwater sits high enough in winter to flood the lower orchard if I am not watching where the fence line dips in the southeast quadrant, because of a surveying error from 1987 that I have simply worked around ever since. I know this land the way a man knows the face of someone he has loved for a long time. And I had just heard my daughter-in-law describe it to a stranger on a telephone as something to be properly positioned. The obstacle. That was the word she had used. The current owners are not an obstacle, not a family, not people, an obstacle. Already solved. I went back inside through the front gate, wrestling with the stiff latch, and I sat at the kitchen table and drank my cold coffee. And I did not tell Margaret what I had heard, because she was in the living room and Derek was still home that morning, and there was no version of that conversation that could happen safely with Derek 20 feet away. But I held it. I held it the way you hold a coal from a fire, carefully at the right distance, making sure it does not go out before you need it. 3 days later, I drove to my shop. Callaway Farm Equipment had been on the corner of Jensen and Elm in Reedley for 22 years. It was not a large operation. 3 service bays, a parts counter, a small showroom for the used equipment I took in, on trade a back office where Margaret had run the books until the stroke. Jimmy Pierce had worked for me for 14 of those 22 years. He was a compact, careful man in his early 50s, with grease permanently in the creases of his knuckles, and the methodical manner of someone who had learned early that taking shortcuts with machinery gets people hurt. I trusted him with every piece of equipment that came through my doors. When I pulled into the lot that morning, Jimmy was in the second bay working on an older John Deere 61-on-10 that belonged to a farming operation near Dinuba. He looked up when he heard my truck, and something happened in his face that I did not immediately understand. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated than surprise. Something that had discomfort in it. He wiped his hands on his shop rag and walked out to meet me. Mr. Callaway, he said. Not Richard. He had called me Richard for 14 years. Good to see you. Jimmy. I shook his hand. How's the deer? Head gasket. Should have it done by Thursday. He was not quite meeting my eyes, which was not like him. Jimmy Pierce looked at everything directly, equipment, problems, people. It was one of the things I valued about him. Something wrong? I asked. He pulled the shop rag through his hands twice. Derek came by Monday, he said carefully. He said going forward any purchasing decisions over $500 need to go through him for approval before we commit. Same with any new service contracts. He paused. He said you had asked him to take a more active role in the business operations while you were managing things at home. I had asked no such thing. I stood in the parking lot of my own business and looked at the man who had worked for me for 14 years and who was looking back at me with the careful expression of someone who suspected he was standing in the middle of something he did not fully understand and did not want to make worse. The service bays behind him were mine. The parts counter was mine. The sign above the door with my name on it was mine. I had swept that parking lot myself for 22 years. I see, I said. Mr. Calloway, Jimmy's voice dropped. I want you to know that I didn't. I mean, if something is going on, Nothing is going on that won't be sorted out shortly, I said. Keep doing your work, Jimmy. You're doing it right. He nodded slowly, and I could see the relief in him and the worry underneath the relief. And I walked back to my truck and sat in it for a moment, with both hands on the wheel before I started the engine. My name was on the sign. My name was still on the sign. Earl Dodson and I have been friends for 40 years. That is not a thing I say lightly. 40 years covers a lot of ground, 2 droughts, 1 flood, that took out his entire almond crop in 2017, the year I lost my father, and he drove 3 hours each way to stand beside me at the funeral without being asked. His property runs along the eastern boundary of mine, separated by a eucalyptus windbreak that we planted together in 1991 and which is now tall enough to see from the county road. We have argued about fence lines and water rights and the correct way to store diesel through winter, and we have never once had an argument that cost us the friendship. That is the definition of the real thing. Earl came by on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, the way he did every few weeks, driving his old Silverado through the front gate and parking it beside the barn without calling ahead, because in 40 years he had never needed to call ahead. He brought a flat of eggs from his hens, the way he always did, and knocked on the back door, and I let him in and put the coffee on, and we sat at the kitchen table the way we had sat at that table 100 times. Savannah was in the living room with Margaret. Derek was in the side yard on his phone. Earl set his hat on the corner of the table and looked at me for a moment before he said anything. He was a big man. Earl broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had been carved for outdoor work, which they had. He was 2 years older than me and had the particular directness of someone who had spent 4 decades saying what he meant, because there was simply no time on a working farm for anything else. "How are you holding up?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Getting along. Margaret looks tired. She has good days and harder ones." Earl nodded and wrapped his hands around his coffee mug and looked at the table for a moment. Outside, I could hear Derek's voice in the side yard, the low cadence of someone talking steadily on a phone, and then the sound stopped, and the back door opened, and Derek came in carrying his phone and wearing the easy smile he put on whenever other people were present. "Earl," Derek shook his hand warmly. "Good to see you. Haven't seen you since the county fair back in August." "That's right." Earl looked at him steadily. "How's business?" "Keeping busy." Derek poured himself coffee without being invited and leaned against the counter the way he had been leaning against my counter for 3 months, with the comfortable ease of a man who considered himself at home in a place that was not his home. "Actually, Earl, I'm glad you stopped by. I've been wanting to talk to some of Dad's neighbors, just to make sure people understand the situation." I looked at Derek. He was not looking at me. He was looking at Earl with an expression of careful, practiced concern. "Dad's not doing as well as he lets on," Derek said. "You know how he is, doesn't want to worry anyone. But between managing the farm and dealing with Mom's situation, it's genuinely more than he can handle right now. He's been forgetting things. Small things, but they add up. Last month he signed off on a parts order he had already placed, doubled the inventory by accident. The month before that, he missed a property tax installment." He shook his head slowly. "We're trying to help, but he doesn't always accept it gracefully. You know how proud he is." I was sitting 18 inches away from my son. He was describing me in the third person to my oldest friend, as though I were not present, as though I were a piece of equipment. He was explaining to a prospective buyer functional, but aging requires oversight, not fully reliable. My hands were flat on the table, I pressed them down and felt the grain of the wood through my palms and did not move. Earl looked at Derek for a long moment. Then he looked at me. I met his eyes and gave him nothing, because there was nothing I could safely give him, with Derek standing at my counter drinking my coffee and explaining my deterioration to the man who had known me for 40 years. "I see," Earl said. His voice was even. "That's a lot to manage." "It is," Derek said. "We're doing our best. Just want to make sure the people closest to them know we're on top of it." Derek took his coffee and went back toward the living room to check on Savannah and Margaret and Earl and I were alone in the kitchen. Earl looked at his mug. He turned it a quarter turn with one hand carefully, the way he handled things he was thinking about. Then he looked up at me. "Richard," he said quietly. "Not now," I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. "Not here." He looked at me for a moment, with the particular steadiness of a man who has known you long enough to read the difference between fine and not fine without needing it explained. Then he nodded once, a single, slow movement, and picked up his coffee and drank it, and we talked about the water table and the almond harvest and the price of diesel. And Derek came back through twice, and each time he was pleasant, and each time Earl was pleasant back, and each time I watched my son perform the role of concerned caretaker for an audience of one, and felt something in my chest pull tighter with every passing minute. Earl left at 4:30. At the back door he stopped and gripped my shoulder with one hand, briefly, the way men do when words are not the right tool for what needs to be communicated. His hand was heavy and certain, and it said everything he could not say with Derek 20 feet away. I stood at the back door and watched his Silverado go down the drive and through the gate, and I thought about 40 years of a man who drove 3 hours to stand beside me at my father's funeral. And I thought about my son standing in my kitchen, describing my failures to that man's face, and I pressed the heel of my hand against my sternum once hard, because the thing in my chest had gotten to a size that required some kind of physical acknowledgement. Then I went back inside. Savannah had made dinner. I sat in the second chair. I ate what was on my plate. I did not taste any of it. Earl called at 8:47 that Friday evening. I know the time because I had been sitting in the small bedroom at the end of the hall since 7, going through the bank statements again with a yellow legal pad and a pencil, writing down dates and amounts in the order they had occurred, building the kind of record that a man builds when he is done being surprised and has moved on to being prepared. Derek and Savannah had gone out after dinner, a restaurant in Fresno. Savannah had said a colleague of hers, and the house was quiet, in the way it only got quiet when they were not in it, a different quality of quiet than the silence they imposed on a room by being present. I picked up on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," Earl said. No preamble. That was Earl. "After you went back inside this afternoon, Derek stayed out by my truck for a few minutes. Walked me out friendly like he was being a good host." "What did he say?" "He told me you had been making some concerning decisions lately. Said you had been talking about selling the farm to cover some debts he wasn't aware of. Said he was worried you might do something rash without telling anyone." A pause. "He said he thought it might be worth it for people who cared about you to keep an eye on things. Neighbors, old friends, people you'd listen to." The pencil in my hand stopped moving. "He was asking you to watch me," I said. "He was asking me to report to him if I noticed anything worrying." Earl's voice carried something in it that I recognized as the particular anger of a man who is too controlled to let it out all the way. "I want you to know," I told him, "that in 40 years I had never once seen you make a rash decision about this land, and that if I had concerns about your judgment, I would come to you directly and not to your son." "What did he say to that?" He nodded and smiled and said he understood, and that he just wanted to make sure everyone was looking out for the family. A beat of silence. Richard, what is going on over there? I looked at the legal pad on the bed beside me. 9 rows of numbers, dates going back to August. $78,000 in neat handwriting on yellow paper. I cannot tell you everything tonight, I said. But I need you to come to a meeting on Sunday. Community Hall, 2 o'clock. Derek's meeting. And Derek thinks it's Derek's meeting. I need you there as a witness. Someone the room will believe. Earl was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the night was full dark, the October stars sharp and cold over the alfalfa field. I'll be there, he said. Whatever you need. I thanked him and ended the call, and sat for a moment on the edge of the bed with the legal pad in my lap. Then my phone rang again. The number was one I recognized, but had not seen in several weeks. Connie Aldridge. Margaret's younger sister, who lived 20 minutes east in Danuba, and who had been notably absent from the house since Derek and Savannah arrived, a fact I had registered without examining carefully enough. Richard, Connie said. She had a voice like Margaret's, but lighter, quicker. I'm at the front. Margaret asked me to come tonight. She said you would understand. I went to the front door. Connie Aldridge was 63 years old, trim and purposeful, with the same gray eyes as her sister, and the same quality of getting directly to what mattered without spending unnecessary time on the way there. She was standing on the porch with a canvas tote bag over one shoulder and an expression that told me she had been holding something carefully for some time and was relieved to be delivering it. She handed me the tote bag. Inside was a manila envelope unsealed with Margaret's handwriting on the front. Not an address, just 2 words. For Richard. She asked me to keep it, Connie said. About 6 weeks ago. She drove herself to my house. She stopped. She drove herself, Richard, in her car, alone. I looked at the envelope. She said she needed somewhere safe for it, Connie continued. She said she didn't know yet what she would need it for, but that when the time came, I would know how to get it to you. She pressed her lips together briefly. I have been waiting 6 weeks to give that to you, and I want you to know that was one of the longer 6 weeks of my life. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table after Connie had gone. Inside were 12 handwritten pages in Margaret's careful, even script, the same handwriting she had used for 20 years of bookkeeping, precise and legible and unhurried. She had dated each entry. The earliest was August 14th. The latest was October 3rd, 3 days before she stood up from the wheelchair. She had written down everything. The conversations she had overheard. The phone calls she had tracked by their timing and duration. The specific language Savannah used when she thought Margaret was asleep, developable frontage corridor estate simplification. The night Derek had sat at the kitchen table after he thought both of them were in bed, going through a folder of documents that Margaret had observed through the partially open hallway door, writing notes in the margins of papers she recognized as relating to the shop's operating accounts. She had written it all down in her careful hand on 12 pages of yellow legal paper, dated and indexed, and then she had sealed it in an envelope and driven herself to her sister's house and left it there to wait. My wife had been building a case for 6 weeks from a wheelchair, alone, without telling me, trusting that when the time came the envelope would find its way to me. I sat at the kitchen table with those 12 pages spread in front of me, and I pressed both hands flat on the paper, and I breathed through what that meant. Not just the information in them. What it meant that she had done this alone. What it meant that she had not known whether I would be the person to receive them or whether something would happen first to prevent it. What it meant that she had done it anyway. I gathered the pages back into their order, returned them to the envelope, and picked up my phone. Tom Greer answered on the 3rd ring, which surprised me given the hour. Tom, I said, I need the revocation ready by Saturday morning, and I need you to make sure Linda Foss's complete file is attached to the court response. I paused. All of it. Every page. Already done, Tom said. I was waiting for you to call. I had been in the small bedroom for about an hour on Saturday night when I heard the knock. Not the back door, not the front. The knock on my bedroom door, the one at the end of the hall, 2 measured raps that were not asking permission so much as announcing an intention. I was sitting on the edge of the bed with the lamp on, reading through Margaret's 12 pages for the 3rd time, committing the details to the kind of memory that does not require notes. It's because the information has become structural part of the way you understand everything that comes after it. I folded the pages into the envelope and put it under the mattress. Then I said, "Come in." Derek opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind him. He was alone. No Savannah. He was wearing the gray thermal shirt he wore around the house in the evenings, and his hair was not combed back the way he wore it when he was performing competence for an audience. He looked for the first time in weeks approximately like himself, or like the version of himself that existed before I understood what that self was actually capable of. He pulled the wooden chair from the corner and sat in it backward, arms crossed over the top rail, the way he had sat in chairs since he was a teenager. I had always thought that was an endearing habit. I was having trouble finding it endearing now. "I know you went to the bank," he said. No warm-up, no concerned son voice. "I know you talked to Tom Greer." I waited. "Savannah found his card in your jacket pocket, the one you left on the hook." He looked at me steadily. His eyes were dry. No performance of emotion this time. "I am not angry, Dad. I want you to understand that. I know how this looks from where you're sitting. I know the statements look bad, but I need you to hear me out before Sunday." "I'm listening," I said. He leaned forward over the chair back. "You are 68 years old. You have been running this farm and that shop for 35 years. You have worked every day of your adult life, and you have built something real, and I am not saying otherwise." He stopped, gathered himself. "But what is the plan, Dad? What is the actual plan for the next 10 years? You run the equipment into the ground, you work until you physically cannot anymore. And then what? The land sits, the shop closes. You have spent your whole life building something, and you have no exit strategy." I looked at my son. The lamp beside the bed put half his face in shadow and the other half in yellow light. And the half I could see was earnest in a way that I might once have found convincing. "I'm trying to help you," he said. "I know the money looks bad. I know I should have talked to you before I moved anything. I panicked after the construction loss, and I made decisions I should not have made unilaterally, and I am telling you that directly right now. But the underlying question doesn't go away just because I handled it wrong. This farm is worth nearly $2 million in the current market. Sitting on it is not a strategy. Letting it pass through probate when the time comes is not a strategy. I have been trying to build a structure that protects you and Mom, and honestly, yes, preserves something for our family going forward." He said our family. He meant his family. He meant himself. "The money you moved," I said. $78,000. What was that a strategy for?" His jaw tightened once, briefly. "I needed to bridge a gap. The construction company was going to fold, and I had personal guarantees on the debt. I moved money to cover obligations, and I intended to replace it. I still intend to replace it." "You moved it without asking." "I had account access you gave me. I gave you account access to pay your mother's medical bills." He looked at the floor for a moment. When he looked back up, his expression had shifted into something more direct than anything he had shown me in 3 months. The pleasant performance had come all the way off, And what was underneath it was not ugly exactly, but it was not something I recognized as my son either. It was something harder and more certain of itself. "Dad," he said, "you are 68 years old. Mom had a stroke. You are managing a farm and a business and a medical situation, and you are doing it alone. What are you proving? Who are you proving it to?" He spread one hand flat in the air between us. "I am not the enemy here. I am the person who is going to be dealing with all of this eventually anyway. I am just trying to get ahead of it." Get ahead of it. I sat on the edge of the bed, in the small room at the end of the hall, in the house I had built with my own hands, and I looked at my son sitting backward on a chair, telling me that my life was something to get ahead of, that my presence on this land, in this house, behind this desk and that counter, was an obstacle on a timeline that had already been written without my knowledge or consent. I thought about Margaret's 12 pages under the mattress beneath me. I thought about Tom Greer's office and 2 sets of documents side by side. I thought about $78,000 and a conservatorship petition and a wedding photograph behind a chest freezer in the barn. I stood up. My knees were stiff from sitting, and the lamp threw my shadow long across the wall behind me. I reached over and turned the lamp off. The room went dark except for the thin line of hall light under the door. "Good night, Derek," I said. He sat in the dark for a moment. Then I heard the chair scrape back and his footsteps crossed to the door. He opened it, and the hall light came in, and he stood in the doorway with his back to me, and I could not see his face. He did not say anything else. He pulled the door shut behind him. I stood in the dark for a long time after that, listening to the house settle around me, and I thought about tomorrow. And I thought about what it costs a man to finally understand something he should have seen much sooner. And I thought about my wife asleep down the hall in a wheelchair she no longer needed, waiting for morning the same as me. I was outside before 5. I did not sleep much after Derek closed the door, and I stopped trying around 4:30, pulled on my work clothes in the dark, and went out through the back without turning on any lights. The October air was cold enough that my breath came out in clouds, and the frost had put a thin silver coat on the top rail of the fence along the south pasture. I walked the perimeter of the equipment barn the way I did most mornings, checking latches and checking locks, making sure everything was as I had left it the evening before. The Kubota sat where it always sat. The secondary tiller. The parts bins along the east wall, each labeled in the handwriting I had developed over 30 years of labeling things so that other people could find them. Everything was exactly where I had put it. Everything was still mine. I went back to the house and started the coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed, watching the sky go from black to the deep blue that comes just before the valley light arrives. By 6, the gold had started at the eastern horizon, and by 6:30 it was full morning, and I was on the back porch with my second cup when I heard the back door open behind me. Margaret came out without the wheelchair. She was using the cane and moving carefully the way she always moved in the mornings when her right leg needed time to cooperate. And she had dressed herself dark slacks, the blue cardigan pearl earrings that caught the morning light when she turned her head. She had done her hair up the way she wore it when she meant to be taken seriously, which in 35 years had never failed to mean exactly that. She lowered herself into the porch chair beside mine and set the cane across her knees and looked out at the farm. We sat for a while without talking, which was not the same as silence. After 35 years, a man learns the difference between the quiet of 2 people who have nothing to say and the quiet of 2 people who have everything to say and are choosing their moment. This was the second kind. The alfalfa in the south field was dry and pale in the October light, ready for the last cutting of the season. The eucalyptus windbreak along the eastern boundary stood straight and dark against the brightening sky. Somewhere behind the barn, one of the cats was moving through the dry grass hunting. "Did you sleep?" Margaret asked. "Some," I said. "You... enough." She turned her head and looked at me with the gray eyes I had been looking into since 1988. "Derek came to your room last night." "How did you know?" "I heard his footsteps in the hall. I know the sound of that boy's walk. I have known it since he was 3 years old." She looked back at the field. "What did he say?" I told her. All of it. The exit strategy, the personal guarantees. Get ahead of it. She listened without interrupting, which was how Margaret always listened when something mattered completely, with her whole attention storing every word in the same careful way she had stored everything else over these past weeks. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He thinks he was making an argument." "He was making an argument." "No." She shook her head slowly. "An argument requires the other person to have standing. He was informing you of a conclusion he had already reached. There is a difference." She picked up her coffee mug from the porch railing. "He has already decided that your time to decide things has passed. Last night was him being courteous enough to tell you so." I looked out at the 80 acres of land I had broken and planted and irrigated and harvested for 35 years. And I thought about what it would mean to have that decision made for me by someone who had not spent a single day of those 35 years doing any of it. "Are you ready for today?" I asked. "I have been ready since the morning I threw those pills into the planter by the window," she said. "The question is whether you are." I turned to look at her. She was watching the field, her profile clear and steady in the morning light, the pearl earring at her earlobe catching a small, bright point of sun. 66 years old and recovering from a stroke, and she had spent 6 weeks sitting in a wheelchair, building a case with a notepad and a pencil, while I had been nodding at dinner and sleeping through what was happening in my own house. "I owe you better than what I gave you these last 3 months," I said. She turned to look at me. "You owe me nothing. You trusted your son. I would have done the same." She'd reached over and put her hand briefly on my forearm, the way she did when something was settled. "What you owe me is the next 35 years. That is what today is about." I put my hand over hers and held it for a moment. And then we both looked back at the farm, and the morning came fully in around us, warm and ordinary, the kind of October morning that has happened on this land every year for as long as I have owned it. "The earrings," I said after a while. "What about them?" "The pearls. You said they make everyone look harmless." The corner of her mouth moved. "Isn't that the point? Is it?" She considered for a moment with the gravity of someone taking the question seriously. "Today it is," she said. "Tomorrow I may go back to the turquoise." I laughed. It came out full and genuine, surprising both of us, and it lasted longer than I expected. And when it faded, I felt something in my chest that had been pulled tight for weeks release a fraction of its tension, not all of it, not nearly all of it, but enough to breathe through. Margaret was smiling at the alfalfa field, and the pearl earring was catching the morning light, and the farm was exactly what it had always been, and I understood that whatever happened in that community hall in 4 hours, this was what we were fighting for. Not the money, not the land value on someone else's spreadsheet. This, a porch and a cup of coffee, and the particular quality of October morning light on a valley farm, and the woman sitting beside me who had loved me well enough to do what I could not do alone. The back door opened, and Savannah's voice came through the screen, pleasant and arranged. "Good morning, you two. Breakfast is almost ready." Margaret and I looked at each other. She raised one eyebrow a fraction of an inch. I stood up and held the door for her, and she rose from the chair with her cane and straightened her cardigan and walked inside, and her step was careful, but it was entirely her own. Before I reveal what really happened when we faced Derek in front of the entire town, comment 1 below to let me know you're still watching. Please keep in mind, the upcoming chapter includes fictionalized moments created for narrative depth. If that's not what you're looking for, feel free to close the video now. The Reedley Community Hall sat on the corner of Manning and G Street, a single-story building with a parking lot of cracked asphalt and a flagpole out front that had been missing its rope for 3 years. I had been inside that building more times than I could count. Farm association meetings, county water board hearings, the occasional potluck that Margaret used to organize before her knees made standing for long periods difficult. It smelled the way it always smelled, of old coffee and folding chairs and the particular institutional cleanser that seems to be standard issue in every community building in the Central Valley, regardless of decade or budget. Derek had arranged the tables into a long rectangle with chairs on all sides. Someone had put a folding table against the back wall with a coffee urn and a plate of store-bought cookies still in their plastic tray. A projector had been set up at one end of the main table connected to Derek's laptop, the screen showing a title slide in clean sans serif font that read, "Callaway Family Estate and Care Planning Discussion." The word discussion was doing considerable work in that title. I pushed Margaret in the wheelchair through the side door at 1:50. She had the blanket across her knees, and her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged into the expression I had come to think of as her listening face, attentive, slightly unfocused, the look of a woman following a conversation at about 70%. It was a precise performance. The pearl earrings were the only thing that did not fit the picture, but nobody in that room was looking at her ears. I looked at who was there. Earl Dodson was already seated near the middle of the right side, his big hands flat on the table, his hat on the chair beside him. He caught my eye when I came in and gave me a single nod. Pastor Bill Hatcher sat near the far end, a lean man in his late 60s with silver hair and the measured stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where emotions ran high and had learned to be the still point in them. Derek had invited him, according to Savannah, as a community witness, someone whose presence would lend the meeting a sense of pastoral gravity. I was glad he was there for different reasons. Linda Foss was in a chair against the back wall, not at the main table. She was wearing her professional clothes, dark slacks, a gray blazer, and she had a folder on her lap that she held with both hands pressed flat on top of it. She looked at me when I came in, and I looked at her, and I moved the wheelchair past the end of the table and positioned Margaret in the spot I had chosen with clear sightlines to the projector screen and to the door. Connie Aldridge was in the second row of chairs along the left wall, a canvas bag at her feet. She did not acknowledge me when I came in, which was exactly right. There were perhaps 20 people in total. Neighbors, business contacts from the shop. 2 cousins of Margaret's I had not seen in several years. The man who ran the feed store in Danuba, where I had been buying in bulk since 1995. People who had known me long enough to remember what I had built and how I had built it and who I had been while I was building it. Derek was at the far end of the room, talking to a man I did not recognize, younger, in a sport coat, carrying a leather portfolio that matched Derek's. I did not ask who he was. I had a reasonable idea. At 2 o'clock, Derek called the room to order. He did it the way he did everything in public, smoothly, with the practiced ease of someone who had decided in advance how the next hour would go. "I want to thank everyone for coming," he said. "I know this is a busy time of year, and I know it is not easy to talk about difficult subjects. But I think we all care about this family, and I think we owe it to each other to have an honest conversation about what comes next." He had the voice exactly right. Concerned, reluctant. A man who had been forced by love into an uncomfortable duty. I had heard that voice at the dinner table for 3 months, and I still felt its pull, even knowing what I knew which told me something about how effective it was on people who did not know what I knew. He talked about Margaret's stroke and her recovery. He said she had made some progress, but that her condition remained serious, and her capacity for complex decision-making had been affected. He said this carefully, with pauses in the right places, the way a man says something he wants people to accept, without examining too closely. He talked about the farm's financial complexity, about the risks of aging assets, about the burden of ongoing management for a couple dealing with a significant health event. He did not look at me while he said any of this. He looked at the room. Then he opened his leather portfolio and took out a set of documents and set them on the table and said, "I have had some professionals help me put together a framework for transitioning management of the estate to ensure Mom and Dad are protected going forward." He slid a copy toward the center of the table. I could see from where I sat that it was a condensed version of the conservatorship petition, reformatted to look like a family planning document rather than a court filing. The word conservatorship did not appear on the first page. The words care management framework did. Pastor Bill Hatcher looked at the document and then looked at me. His expression was careful, and I could see him doing the thing that good people do in rooms where something is wrong, feeling the temperature of the air and not yet knowing what is producing the heat. Derek picked up his copy of the documents and turned to Margaret and said with genuine warmth in his voice, the kind of warmth that had nothing false in it, because it was simply the warmth of a man who believed he was winning, "Mom, I know some of this is complicated, but we just want to make sure you're taken care of. You understand that, right?" He reached across and put his hand over hers on the blanket. Margaret looked at his hand on hers. Then she looked up at his face. And I watched my wife hold that gaze for exactly 3 seconds, with the pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light, and the blanket across her knees, and 20 people in the room not breathing quite right. Then she moved. She pushed Derek's hand off hers first. Not violently. Not with drama. She simply lifted her right hand and moved his away from it, the way you move something that has been placed where it does not belong. Derek's hand stayed in the air for a half-second before he pulled it back. Then Margaret reached down and pulled the blanket off her knees and dropped it onto the seat of the wheelchair beside her. The room had been talking at a low murmur. It stopped. She placed both hands on the armrests of the wheelchair and pushed herself up. Her right leg shook once at the knee and she absorbed it without changing her expression, and she came fully upright and stood there in the fluorescent light of the Reedley Community Hall in her dark slacks and blue cardigan, with the pearl earrings catching the light, and her chin level and her eyes clear, and 20 people in that room forgot how to breathe at the same moment. Derek said, "Mom." She reached down beside the wheelchair and picked up the cane and snapped it open in 2 movements, and took 1 step, then 2, then 4 more around the end of the table. The rubber tip of the cane on the linoleum floor was the only sound in the room for the 6 seconds it took her to walk to the position she had chosen, which was directly across the table from her son, with the projector screen behind her, and 20 witnesses in front of her, and nothing between her and Derek except 8 feet of folding table and 38 years. She stopped. She looked at him. "Now explain it again," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "This time assume I understand English." Derek's face had gone the color of old concrete. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The man in the sport coat beside him shifted in his chair. Earl Dodson put both hands flat on the table. Pastor Bill Hatcher set down the document he had been holding and did not pick it up again. Margaret opened the canvas bag that Connie Aldridge had placed on the table in front of her. Connie had moved it there in the 30 seconds of stunned silence, while Margaret was walking quietly without being asked, because they had spoken the night before, and Connie knew exactly what was needed and when. Margaret removed a sheaf of papers and set them on the table and smoothed them flat with one hand. I'm going to read some numbers, she said to the room. I would like everyone to listen. She read them. Every transaction, every date, every dollar amount. Her voice was steady and the voice of a woman who had spent 20 years keeping books and knew that numbers spoken clearly in a room full of witnesses carry a weight that no explanation can fully dislodge afterward. $8,500, August 9th. $9,200, August 17th. $7,800, August 26th. She read all 9 transactions without pausing, and when she finished, she looked up and said, $78,000, transferred from our joint account to Derek Callaway Construction LLC over a period of 6 weeks, without being asked, without our knowledge, using account access that was given for the sole purpose of paying medical bills. The room was the kind of quiet that has texture to it. Derek said, "Mom, those were authorized farm expenses." "Sit down, Derek." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. He sat. She reached into the bag again and removed 2 sets of documents and held them up, one in each hand. "This is my physical therapy record," she said, holding up the left. "Prepared by Linda Foss, my licensed physical therapist, documenting my condition and progress from the date of my stroke through last week." She held up the right. "This is the document Savannah submitted to Fresno County Superior Court in support of a petition to remove my right and my husband's right to manage our own affairs. It uses my name and my therapist's name." She set both down on the table side by side. "They are not the same document." Linda Foss stood up from the chair against the back wall. She was not asked. She simply stood because she had been waiting for this moment for 6 weeks, with the particular tension of someone who knows something important and has been prevented from saying it. "I can confirm," she said clearly, "that the document on the right contains only the first page of my original report. The pages documenting Mrs. Callaway's recovery, including her achievement of independent ambulation with a cane at week 6, were not included." Someone at the far end of the table said quietly but distinctly, "Good Lord." Earl Dodson's jaw was tight. He was looking at Derek with the expression of a man who had driven 3 hours to a funeral for someone he had been told for weeks was not capable of making sound decisions. Savannah pushed her chair back from the table. Her voice came out sharp and bright, the professional voice stripped of its warmth. "Those expenses were legitimate investments in the property. Richard approved the account access himself. We have been managing an impossible situation for 3 months, and this is completely—" I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I had not raised my voice once in this entire room. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed 2 documents that Tom Greer had prepared and notarized the previous afternoon, and I placed them on the table where the room could see them. "This is a revocation of the power of attorney Derek holds over the equipment shop," I said. "Signed and notarized yesterday. Effective immediately communicated to the bank and the shop this morning." I placed the second document beside it. "This is the County Planning Department's preliminary notification of the proposed Highway 989 corridor expansion, the one that runs through the eastern edge of our property." I looked at Savannah. "The one that increases the assessed value of our land by approximately $1.4 million. The one you have known about since August." Savannah's mouth opened. No sound came out. "I found the listing inquiry you sent," I said. "The one where you described my wife's stroke and my age as factors that would facilitate a quick transaction." I let that sit in the room for a moment. "You used the word obstacle. I want everyone here to understand what word she chose." The man in the sport coat was looking at the table. The feed store owner from Danuba had his arms crossed and his face closed. Pastor Bill Hatcher had his hands folded in front of him and was looking at Derek with an expression I had never seen on a pastor's face before, which was the expression of a man who had been used as a prop and was taking a moment to understand the full dimensions of that. Derek stood up. His chair scraped back hard against the linoleum. The pleasant voice was gone completely, and what came out instead was something raw and certain that had been waiting behind the performance for 3 months. You want to know the truth, eh? His voice cracked at the edges and his hands came down flat on the table. You are 68 years old. Mom had a stroke. You are sitting on $2 million of land, and you don't have a plan, and you never have had a plan. And I have spent my entire adult life watching you hold on to things past the point of reason because you cannot admit that time moves. That land should have been mine years ago. I have been waiting my entire life, and I am done waiting for you to decide when it is convenient for you to stop existing. The room was absolutely still. Done waiting for you to decide when it is convenient for you to stop existing. I stood across the table from my son, and I looked at his face, and I understood that whatever I had been hoping to find underneath the performance, some version of the boy I had raised, some residue of the person I had believed him to be, was not there. Had perhaps not been there for a long time. And I felt the last of something release in my chest, not painfully, not like a wound, but the way a wrong note finally resolves. Quiet. Final. A door closing on the right side. Pastor Bill Hatcher stood up slowly. He walked around the table and he placed his hand on my shoulder and he stood there. And he did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the room had not already heard. The meeting did not end so much as it dissolved. People stood in ones and twos and gathered their things with the careful movements of those who have witnessed something they will be thinking about for a long time and are not yet ready to put into words. The feed store owner from Danuba shook my hand on his way out and held it a beat longer than necessary. Earl Dodson waited until nearly everyone else had gone, and then came around the table and stood beside me and said, "You call me if you need anything at all." He said it the way he said everything that mattered without ornamentation, and then he put his hat on and walked out into the October afternoon. Derek and Savannah left without speaking to either of us. Derek walked out first, his leather portfolio under his arm, his shoulders set in the rigid way of a man holding himself together by main force. Savannah followed 3 steps behind him. She did not look at Margaret. She did not look at me. She looked at a point somewhere above the exit door and she walked through it, and the door swung shut behind her. And that was the last time either of them set foot in a room I was in as anything other than strangers. Pastor Bill stayed until the end. He helped fold the chairs, and he did not make it strange, just worked quietly alongside me the way a neighbor works. And when we were done, he shook my hand and said, "I am sorry I didn't see it sooner." I told him there was nothing to see until there was, and he nodded and left. Margaret sat at the end of the table without the wheelchair. She was tired. I could see it in the set of her shoulders and the way her right hand rested heavily on the cane. But her eyes were clear and her back was straight, and she looked like what she was, which was a woman who had done what she came to do. "How do you feel?" I asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Like someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down," she said. "My shoulder still remembers the weight, but my hands are free." I sat beside her, and we stayed there for a few minutes in the quiet of the emptied room, while the afternoon light came through the high windows and lay in long rectangles across the linoleum floor. The legal work took the better part of 3 weeks. Tom Greer filed the formal response to the conservatorship petition, with Linda Foss's complete records attached, and the court dismissed it before the November hearing date. The civil claim under California's Elder Financial Abuse Statute resulted in a repayment agreement requiring Derek to return the full $78,000 with interest structured as a formal debt instrument with monthly payments and default provisions. Derek Callaway Construction, LLC filed for dissolution in late October. Savannah's real estate license was placed under review by the California Department of Real Estate following the submission of the altered medical records to the court. These things did not happen with fanfare. They happened the way most justice happens in offices and conference rooms and through documents that required signatures and processing time and the unhurried attention of people whose job it is to make things official. And I had sat at the wrong chair and smiled and said nothing, and the meal had tasted like nothing at all. That evening I sat on the back porch until the stars came out over the alfalfa field, and I stayed there long enough that the temperature dropped, and I could see my breath, and I did not go back inside until I was certain I could do it without showing anything on my face that did not belong there. Linda Foss came back the following Thursday. No canceled appointments, no redirected phone calls. She knocked on the back door at 9 in the morning, and Margaret met her in the kitchen, standing with coffee already poured for both of them. And I watched from the doorway for a moment before I went out to the barn, because some things do not need an audience. By the end of October, Margaret was walking the length of the back porch without the cane on good mornings. She still used it outside on uneven ground, and on the days when her right leg reminded her that a stroke is not something you simply conclude, but something you negotiate with for a long time afterward. She did not complain about those days. She reported them the way she had always reported problems in the shop books, accurately, without drama, as information rather than grievance. We ate at the kitchen table together, the two of us, and I sat at the head of it. Nobody commented on this because there was nobody to comment. Margaret had put 2 new hooks beside the back door, one for my barn jacket, one for her cardigan when the mornings were cold. Small changes, the kind that do not announce themselves but settle into a house and become part of how it breathes. I noticed them the way I was noticing most things now, which was more carefully and later than I should have, but with considerably more intention than before. I went back to the shop the week after the meeting. Jimmy Pierce was at the parts counter when I came in, and he looked up and said, "Morning, Mr. Callaway." And I said, "Richard, Jimmy." It has always been Richard. And he nodded and went back to what he was doing, and that was the entirety of what needed to be said. I reinstated the purchasing authority. I signed the parts orders that had been accumulating. I sat in the back office where Margaret's handwriting was still on the filing tabs, and I went through 3 weeks of deferred decisions and made them one at a time, carefully reading everything before I acted on it, which I understood now was not a slow way to do things, but simply the right way. The Northfield irrigation timer got its new solenoid valve on a dry Tuesday afternoon in early November. I did the job myself, which took longer than it would have taken 10 years ago, and went correctly the first time, which is the trade a man makes with age if he is paying attention. The system ran its full cycle that evening without sticking. I stood at the edge of the field and watched the water move through the lines and felt something settle in me that had been unsettled for a long time. Margaret came out and stood beside me. She had the cane but was not leaning on it heavily. The November air was cold enough that our breath came out in small clouds, and the last of the alfalfa was pale and dry in the evening light. "It works," she said. "It works," I said. She put her hand through my arm the way she had done on cold evenings for 35 years, and we stood there until the cycle finished and the field went quiet. And then we went inside together. And I made dinner for the first time in months, and it was nothing special, and it was exactly right. 2 weeks later, Tom Greer called and said the documents were ready. The drive to Tom Greer's office took 20 minutes. I had driven that route hundreds of times over the years. Farm supply runs, county meetings, the occasional lunch in town when Margaret could persuade me to leave the property on a weekday. I knew every turn. I knew the place where the road dipped near the old canal and filled with standing water after rain. I knew the billboard for the Reedley auto dealer that had been advertising the same truck model for 3 years because nobody had bothered to update it. That morning I drove it differently. I noticed things I had not noticed in years. The way the November light came flat and gold across the valley floor. The silhouette of the grain elevator against the pale sky. A hawk sitting on a fence post along the county road, completely still watching the field below it, with the particular patience of something that knows exactly what it is waiting for. Margaret sat in the passenger seat with her cane between her knees and her hands folded on top of it. She was wearing the turquoise earrings. She had told me that morning with considerable finality that she was done with pearls for a while. I had not argued. I had learned over 35 years, and especially over the past 4 months, that there are conversations worth having, and conversations that simply end correctly when you nod and get the truck keys. Tom Greer was standing when we came through the door. He shook my hand and then Margaret's, and he looked at her the way people looked at her now, when they had not seen her since before October, with a kind of recalibration happening behind their eyes, a quiet revision of the version of her they had been carrying. She bore this with complete composure, which was to say she ignored it entirely, and asked Brianna at the front desk about her daughter's soccer season. The office had its November light. It came in through the west-facing windows in long amber rectangles and lay across Tom's desk and across the document package he slid toward me when we sat down, and I thought about light and what it does to things, how it makes some things look more important than they are, and other things exactly as important as they deserve to look. The package was substantial. A living trust establishing Margaret and me as co-trustees of all Callaway family assets with explicit successor trustee provisions and language specifically designed to make any future conservatorship claim exceptionally difficult to sustain. Alongside it was the updated will which Tom had restructured entirely from the previous version. And beneath that, a document I had spent considerable time thinking about over the past 3 weeks, a structured buyout agreement transferring the equipment shop to Jimmy Pierce over a 5-year period. At terms we had worked out together at the shop on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 cups of bad coffee and a handshake at the end that meant more to me than the paperwork. Jimmy had cried when I first proposed it. Not openly, he was not that kind of man, but his eyes had gone red at the rims, and he had looked at the parts counter for a long moment before he trusted himself to speak. He said he did not know what to say. I told him the shop needed someone who would treat it the way it deserved to be treated, and that I had been watching him do exactly that for 14 years, and that was all the qualification I needed. He nodded, and we shook hands, and the matter was settled in the way that the best matters are settled, between 2 people who trust each other without requiring the trust to be explained. "Everything is in order," Tom said, pushing the package toward me. "The yellow tabs mark your signature lines. It is a straightforward execution from here." He meant it helpfully. He was not wrong about the mechanics of it. Pick up the pen, find the tabs, sign your name. 20 years ago, I would have done exactly that. 10 years ago. 3 months ago at 9:30 at night in my own kitchen with cold coffee going stale beside me and my son's finger tapping a line on a page he had not given me time to read. I picked up the pen. Then I put it back down. The amber light lay across the pages, and I sat with the pen beside my hand, and I let myself remember that kitchen. The way Derek had stood at the edge of the table relaxed, and certain the portfolio open to exactly the page he wanted me to see. "Just sign here, Dad." It is routine. Tax stuff. Nothing interesting. And I had signed because it was 9:30 and I was tired, and he was my son, and I had been trusting him since the day he was born, and trust, when it runs, that deep for that long, does not announce itself as trust anymore. It just feels like the way things are. Margaret was sitting beside me. She had turned her head slightly toward the window, and the turquoise earring caught a point of the amber light and held it. And she did not say anything because she already knew. After 35 years, she could read the particular quality of my silences, the way a good farmer reads weather, not by looking at one thing, but by feeling the whole atmosphere of a moment and understanding what it was about to do. "I am going to read it first," I said. "All of it." Tom did not react with surprise. He simply nodded and pushed the first page toward me and folded his hands on the desk and settled into the particular stillness of a man who has been doing this work for 30 years and knows that the most important thing he can do in certain moments is absolutely nothing. I read every page, each provision, each definition, each clause that began with whereas, and each that began with in the event of. When I did not understand something, I asked, and Tom explained it completely, and I made sure I understood the explanation before I turned the page. I asked 2 questions, one about the successor trustee provision and what would trigger its activation, and one about the timeline and default provisions in the shop buyout agreement. Tom answered both fully. I understood both answers. It took 21 minutes. When I reached the last signature line, I read the paragraph above it twice. Then I picked up the pen and signed my name in the place provided, and I meant every letter of it, which is the only way a signature should ever be given. Tom gathered the pages and squared them and put them into their folders with the efficiency of someone for whom this represented a conclusion properly reached. He stood and shook my hand again, and then Margaret's, and there was something in the way he did it, a fraction more pressure, a beat longer than professional courtesy required, that told me he understood what this particular set of documents represented beyond their legal content. We walked out into the November afternoon. Margaret's cane on the sidewalk, my hand at her elbow, not because she needed steadying, but because it was where my hand belonged. The valley air was cold and clean, and smelled of turned earth from a field someone had been working down the road. The farm was 20 minutes east. The alfalfa was done for the season. The irrigation timer on the north field was running correctly. Jimmy Pierce was at the shop, which was where he needed to be doing work he was good at on a path toward something that was his. Margaret looked at me over the roof of the truck. The turquoise earring caught the last of the afternoon light. "Well," she said. "Well," I said. I opened her door. She got in. I walked around to the driver's side and got in and started the engine and pulled out onto Fulton Street and turned east, and the road ahead was clear and entirely ours, and I drove us home. I built this farm with my hands and nearly signed it away with them too. That is the truth I have to live with. I trusted my son the way fathers trust completely without checking, and that trust became the door they walked right through. So let me say this plainly, man to man, do not be like me. Do not let love make you lazy. Do not let a familiar face make you stop reading what is in front of you. The people who genuinely care about you will never need you to sign something you have not read. That is not love. That is leverage. I believe God gave me Margaret for exactly this reason, because she had the clarity I had lost and the courage to hold it until I was ready to see. My personal view is simple. Real family justice is not loud. It does not arrive with sirens. It arrives on a Tuesday morning when you finally put the pen down and say, "Not yet, let me read this first." These revenge stories family carries are not really about revenge. They are about reclaiming what was always yours. Your voice, your land, your right to decide. If this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. What would you have done differently? and subscribe to Wise Revenge, where family justice finds you every week through stories that matter. Thank you sincerely for staying until the very last word. The stories ahead contain fictional elements built entirely for reflection and life lessons. If that is not your preference, no hard feelings, and may you find exactly what speaks to you elsewhere.